So this session is kind of, yeah, what it says on the tin. It's done on the back of some work that I did for a recent AWS user group presentation where I put together this website. Things I wish I knew when starting with AWS. And obviously I didn't want to spend an awful lot of time, mucking with the actual site. I just wanted to get some content up there. And I thought it was probably, and actually a thing happened. So, this is in this session, we're going to talk about the front end bit. We're going to talk about the back end bit. I suspect every person in this room, if they learn something, is going to learn something different because we've all got different skill sets. But I remember asking Emma about some JavaScript that I wrote behind this random button that I had at top. It's meant to sort of take you to a random page on the site. And it didn't occur to her at the time that a website could be an entirely static thing. You guys spend so much time in React building entire software systems that effectively run inside a browser. They're like multi-tier applications running inside a browser, and that's seems so normal today. But sometimes you just need to get content up there, and it doesn't need to be dynamic in the true sense that data is kind of changing when you're not looking at it. What I hope some of you might see when we go through this today is that the website, you can make a website look surprisingly dynamic for what is actually 100% static content when you use one of these static content processes like Jekyll that we'll look at today. So the plan is to try and deploy a site over the course of lunchtime. So I've
maybe just zoom in a bit.
Okay.
Is this session sponsored by Squarespace?
It's not sponsored by Squarespace. It's kind of the opposite, because I don't know how many of you have ever tried to work with WordPress.
It's before my time.
Well, I know it's not a new technology, but it's pretty pervasive, and the Squarespaces of the world and what have you are basically WordPress hosting services.
Same with Lightsail on AWS.
Well, Lightsail is a infrastructure hosting service that just happens to be able to spin up a WordPress instance for you, and that's something that I tried to do for a friend of mine who was a musician who was gaining a fair bit of press, and he needed a website quite quickly. And at the time I went, Lightsail, spin up a WordPress. And then I realized what administrating a WordPress instance is like. Now, if you're a pro, it's probably fine, right? You learn how to do this stuff over time, but I don't want to be a WordPress administrator. I really don't. And PHP is not where I want to invest my time. I found it to be not only the learning curve sort of somewhat steep, and you had to be in the ecosystem to understand what all the plugins did and that kind of stuff. But actually, the cost of running it, even on Lightsail, right? You're looking at, I don't know, maybe $10 to $20 a month to run what is in effect, what was for this guy, a static site. You just wanted a bit of content management, but it didn't need to be live content management. And that's what this Jekyll thing does for us. It is content management, but everything's happening offline. And then you're just pushing the results of that online. So you don't need databases. You don't need application servers. You just need a web server. So yes, Lightsail was a thing. Now, can everybody read that? Is it blown up enough?
Yeah, that's good. I'm not sure about people online.
Maybe just one.
Yeah, that's good.
One for me.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, that's a bit better.
So I've got everything kind of laid out in a README file here. I'm going to execute code from that README file. Ask questions as we go. I was going to say something else about. Oh yeah, it will be. I'll probably move this repo to the J1 repo if anybody's interested in taking it further.
Jacob just put out a good point on light sail. He doesn't like it. Automates creating an EC2 instance with the lamp stack.
Yeah.
You are still ultimately responsible for upgrading everything.
Mm-hmm.
I have used Amplify before, and that's pretty good. Like just to deploy a React app on the wiki static. But yeah, I haven't used Lightsail before.
Yeah, well, Lightsail is just a wizard for VPC and EC2.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it just creates IP addresses, a little bit of RDS as well. It's a wrapper on a bunch of other infrastructure services that just tries to make it easier. But it's not cheap for basic things. Are we good to proceed?
Yeah.
All right. So I've made a few assumptions here about how we're going to run this. That it's via VS Code. That we've got our remote containers extension installed because I'm going to build and run this within a container, and therefore you've got Docker or Docker Desktop installed, depending on what platform you're on. So we can make sure that this is working for us. And it is not. Why is that?
On yours, X1. We are running Ubuntu. Yeah. Because it supports like the Lenovo laptops. They have Ubuntu.
X1.
Yeah.
Actually, it's because I was doing it within the container, right? So I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. The README assumes that you haven't yet pulled down the repo that has the basics that we're going to work with, including the Docker file. So now I'm in WSL. That should work just fine. Yeah, there we go. All right, so here's the repository. You can see it on the left. So it's cloned, and we've already opened it in VS Code. But now we're going to open the dev container. Let's take a quick look at what's in there. I really don't like the VS Code native containers. There's got all this magic in that you don't know what it does. So this is just a simple latest Ubuntu with a few, curl and git and JQ and a few sort of basic utility packages. Then a few packages that Jekyll. So Jekyll's written in Ruby. So there's a few dependencies there, GCC and make, and Ruby itself, of course. Then once we've got the dependencies installed, we can use gem, which is the Ruby package manager, to install Jekyll itself. Bundler is kind of like NVM, I think. It's sort of a runtime kind of virtualization for Ruby. And this thing, WebRig, isn't usually required, but at the time that I was building this, there was a relatively recent version of Ruby released, and for whatever reason, the packages just weren't bringing down. So Jekyll couldn't run without this thing called WebRig, and it wasn't coming down. So it's a dependency that we shouldn't have to install. Will probably get fixed in weeks. And then just installing the AWS CLI, right? So basically, it's a Ruby execution environment with AWS connectivity. So let's open up in the container.
Have you tried GitHub Pages before?
Not directly, but GitHub Pages is powered by Jekyll.
Yeah, they have, yeah, that's what I was gonna mention.
Yeah.
Well, optionally, you can also just use your own, but yeah, by default.
All right, so we've opened our environment in the container. We've opened a shell. It's probably worth, we're going to set a profile, AWS CLI profile called lab profile. We're going to set our default region to Sydney. Now we're just going to call get caller identity just to make sure that we can connect to AWS, because we're going to need to do that. As I've been mucking around this morning, I've got an SSO session that's still valid, so that was a successful test. Yes, we've got our AWS CLI version 2 installed. Yes, we've got JQ installed. Ooh. Yes, we should have Jekyll installed because we're running in a container that had it installed. So that's great. We're just going to set our current directory as our project directory. Make sure that that's the case. Yep. Lab Jekyll AWS. And we're just going to set another couple of environment variables here. So the first one's going to be the host name of our site. So we're setting that to my doc site current date .abstractable.io. For simplicity purposes here, abstractable.io is a domain that I already have. We're just going to create this on a subdomain, abstractable.io. And then we're going to create this site within our project directory. So we're just going to give the site a name. It could just as easily be a www directory, but we'll call it my doc site today. All right, so then let's have a chat about Jekyll for those that don't know. So it's a static site generator, which means it'll take text-based files in and output text-based files, but it does something to them in the meantime. So it will either pass through content that shouldn't be processed or doesn't need to be processed and just copy it to a deployable site, or if you signal to the processor that something needs to be processed, it will parse it and do something fancy to the content before outputting it as HTML, CSS, JS, or what have you. So what you're left with after the processing is a hierarchy of files. You do not need application servers, you do not need databases, you just need a web server to deploy this thing. And so why would we do that? Because we need minimal back-end infrastructure, so that's going to make it quick to set up. It's cheap, so at its most basic version, it's the cost of storage on an S3 bucket. Plus, if you got slash dotted, yes, there is a get object kind of charge on S3 for requests. I'll just give you an idea of the resources that we're going to configure today. It's pretty simple. We were going to create, we're going to create a record against a Route 53 hosted zone, which is going to be our host for the website. We'll need to create a certificate for the SSL communications to that endpoint. We'll be creating a web content S3 bucket, which is where we'll put our processed site. We'll create a separate bucket to hold the access logs for the website, but we're not going to enable as much, you can expose an S3 bucket as a web server to the open internet, but we miss out on a bunch of features like, for instance, SSL and caching and a bunch of other things. So we're going to wrap, we're going to make that bucket inaccessible to the world and only accessible via CloudFront, which is, our content distribution network. So that's how we'll proxy out access to the actual content. All right, so again, why are we doing this thing? Minimal infrastructure, it's cheap, simple to understand, it's simple to maintain. The developer experience, as I hope to demonstrate very shortly, is outstanding in terms of its instant response. So we'll demo that in a minute. And I don't think I've ever seen an easier deployment of any kind of system ever. Right, so we're going to create a new site. At the moment, we've got nothing but an operating system that has Ruby and the Jekyll libraries installed. So this is how we create a, let's clear this for everyone's benefit. Jekyll, new, and the name of your site. Done. So you'll see here my doc site. This is the initial files created on, in React, it would be init or whatever it is when you create your base site. I'm just going to set that directory as our site base so that we can navigate there shortly. Now, before we talk about some of the stuff that's in there, I'm also just going to remove the gem file and the gem file lock. We don't really need this package management at the moment. Kind of gets in our way. So delete, delete. Should find that they are gone, which is great.
They're not gone.
Sorry?
They're not gone.
Oh, what happened there?
Yeah, CD into it.
Is this inside the container?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't CD. That's right. That should have worked, shouldn't it? There we go. Right. So there's fairly few resources in here. HTML files are going to get pushed through to the output. Nothing much will happen to those as a general rule. But we've got some markdown files here, and they will get processed by the Jekyll processor before we're done. There is a signal that makes that happen though, and that is this little convention here. So if you've got a dash 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 followed by a dash dash dash, even with nothing in between it, that's called the front matter of a file, and that's a signal to Jekyll that it needs to do something with this file, process it. So if it's markdown, as this file is, then that markdown is going to get rendered as HTML. But some other stuff also happens in the meantime, which is we get to set some variables. So we can literally put anything in this front matter, as they call it. Just create a thing called myVar, my value. And if I want to reference that in the page or elsewhere, I can. Some of these, so they are just variables, but there are parts of the processor that are taking hints from some of those variables. So for instance, layout is a hint to use a particular template for, so it's going to process this markdown as the body, turn it into HTML, and then presumably include that within some header and footer type stuff set as a page layout. You'll see this posts directory up here. Vanilla Jekyll assumes you're blogging, but it doesn't necessarily need to. If we have a look at a blog page here, we'll see when we process this that under posts, that's a bit of a special directory. It'll create a date-based hierarchy as if it was a set of blog posts. But you can create any directory arbitrarily here, and everything underneath that, if you want it to be processed. If you put front matter into the file, it will get processed. and you can specify which sort of structure to publish it to at the end of the day. I'll show you in a sec. And then there's our main config file, which is ultimately just setting a bunch of site scope variables. We can set the site title, the emails for email links. There's very little in a vanilla Jekyll site. It sets the kind of default theme called minima, which is barely a theme at all. It creates an RSS feed. It uses an RSS feed plugin. I think that's only really there to show you that if you want to, you can use plugins. So it's very minimal in its basic form.
So does this support the entirety of the markdown syntax? So you put pictures and all that in there?
Yep.
Links?
Yep, pretty much. We'll go through a few more examples of the actual syntax, but yes, it pretty much supports. I haven't come across anything in Markdown that it doesn't support. What it also supports is the Liquid templating language. Has anyone come across that before? I think, not 100% sure. I think Liquid came from, well, you see here, there's this Shopify. So let's have a look what in this rendered version here. So the TLDR on Liquid is in my files. I can drop double curly braces, and that will output content. So if I have a variable called variable, the value of that variable will get output wherever I have that thing. Then there's some really nifty filters that we can put on that. So you can see here we've got like a string literal value that we can pipe into this filter called absolute URL. So that's going to convert this relative URL to an absolute URL. That can be useful when creating links and what have you. We might have a YAML defined array called site members, right? We can put a find filter on that. So where this will return the first value in the list called site members that has a graduation year of 2014. So this is one of those things where it starts to, feels a little bit dynamic, but you've got to have that information at build time of the site in order for it to be rendered. But it just means you don't need to edit the content now. You can edit a config file and use it to drive content on the site. Likewise here, we could feed this string literal into a Slugify filter, and it's going to replace the spaces with dashes and make a sort of URL friendly version of that. So that's the double curly braces. The other main convention is the curly brace with the % symbol, which is basically a code block. So here we have an if statement. If product title, whether that variable could be defined in multiple places, but if product title equals something, then print something. Otherwise, this block would print nothing. So yeah, it's relatively simple, relatively powerful. So if we wanted to build this thing, that's pretty easy. We would just go Jekyll build. That's it. That site's just been built. Only two things changed here. This Jekyll cache thing got created. Just ignore it. The git ignore does. It's just just supports Jekyll. The main thing is this underscore site directory that gets created. This is your post-process site. It's all static content. This is what we publish. So that was done. However, we don't want to be building and deploying in order to see what we're doing. So we do have a local development option. So we just run Jekyll serve. There we go. Got a site. Here's that one post that was in the default site. Just move that to the right hand side for a second. All right. So we could go to that post. For a second, go to that post. Where are we? I was on the side. Let's get rid of. In fact, let's just get rid of all of the content. New content. Now, if you keep your eye down here on our sort of dev server that's running, when I hit save on this, it's going to rebuild that. I'll go back to our local host. I refresh the site, bam, new content. All right, that was easy, but it was also too much work. This live reload feature is just, this is what I love. So we'll stop the dev server and we'll start it again with the live reload option enabled. So there was the post as it was. So now save that file. It automatically updates in the browser. That's sort of the kind of dev round tripping here is super quick. So I briefly mentioned before that the Jekyll supports themes and plugins, right? So themes provide assets and layouts and includes and style sheets. It's the cosmetic stuff that sort of builds a UI framework for you to work within. And then it also has a plugin system that will do a million different things. There's a fairly large community for this stuff, but typical examples, you saw one before, creating your RSS feed, or you might have one that creates SEO, search engine optimized content for your headers or any of that kind of stuff. In fact, the site that we're going to install a documentation theme shortly. That doc theme, for every page we create, it can, if you enable the option, will also create a PDF. So we're creating this Jekyll powered site that's going to render HTML and PDF, so you can have online and offline documentation. And I'm pretty sure that's partly done through the plugin system.
Is that just like some third-party plugin, or is that Jekyll themselves, that the developers of Jekyll that made that? Source, I think it's just open source. Yeah. So anyone can make a plugin.
Yep. All right. So yeah, let's move on to that. So we're not going to install this documentation theme as a theme. So there's a way of doing that where you add an entry to your config file and make sure you've got the gem package, the Ruby package installed. This author has actually created a repo that is a Jekyll site after you've installed the plugin. So we're going to run off and get that. And in fact, what I think, yes. So hold on, we're going to kill our local server first. We're in our project directory. We're going to remove the site that we just created. We don't need that. We're going to download this repo that has the theme pre-installed. We're going to unzip that repo. and then we're going to copy the files that we need into my doc site. So my doc site, you will now see, has a lot more stuff in it because this is the contents of that repo.
And I see that the error page become markdown.
MG here, not HTML.
Yes. Yep. Yep, because it's got.
Fanciness.
Yeah. So we'll get rid of the gem file, get rid of the gem file lock. We're going to get, there's a bit of Docker config, which we don't need because we've got our own execution environment. So we'll just get rid of that stuff. Now, let's check if this site works. So we're just running Jekyll serve with the live reload feature enabled. Our IDE is going to be nice enough to ask us to open it. And bam, here is our theme. This theme is pretty impressive.
It'd be fantastic for like knowledge bases and that with a team of people.
100%. So it supports multiple products. So if you select a top level product there, the whole nav is specific to that product. So you could yeah, as if you got a suite of products, you could manage the documentation within one project if you so wished. So yeah, each product has its own nav, and then you've got, you know, collapsing menu. You can set this thing to support you know, multiple expanding multiple things if you want. You can turn off the table of contents because that's generated automatically. All that table of contents stuff's generated automatically for you. Yeah, none of the nav or the linking you have to manage. You just need to put pages in. That's our front end, right? We can apply whatever changes we want now to that template at our content. Let's configure the back end and get it up there. Yes, I know that we should be automating all this stuff, but the point of this demo was to walk people that haven't created some of these resources through the process of creating them. We'll do it in the AWS console, so you get a feel for what's there. So first thing we're going to do is configure our web server, which is just basically our bucket. So space. All right, so we're in the S3 console. We're going to create a new bucket. So I'm going to need the name of our host, and that's going to be our bucket name. We're going to set the region to Sydney. This one is going to have access control list disabled. I mean, we don't have time to go through all the features, but S3 can be secured in a couple of ways. ACLs are kind of a legacy way of doing that. And if you can, you sort of generally avoid using them. We're going to see the next bucket that we create that we do need to use them, but right now we don't need the ACLs. We are going to leave all public access blocked. We don't want anybody to be able to access this content, only CloudFront. We don't need bucket versioning. Doesn't really make sense. We've got version control for all of our content. Encryption, why not? I mean, it's pretty much as simple as going enable and use S3 managed keys, and we'll never need to think about it again. So do it if you can. Pretty much done. Let's create the bucket. Great. Now we're going to create a bucket for our access logs. So we'll create it with the same name, but .logs, same region. But this time, in order to give CloudFront access, we will enable ACLs. We will continue to block all public access. We still don't need bucket versioning. We might create tags in the real world. Enable encryption. So, all right, now we need to create, before we create our content distribution, we'll need to create the certificate that we use for SSL. So we're going to go into the certificate manager. Now here's a trick for young players. CloudFront will want to find that certificate in US East 1 and US East 1 only.
Run into that already. And I'm like, how do I transfer my certificate?
It's, yeah.
And yeah, no, just make it again.
It's a common wrinkle in build and deployment processes. All right.
Still not as good as CDK.
So I'm going to go to North Virginia. I'm going to request a certificate. It's a public certificate.
Best thing ever.
The domain name that we are going to use for this certificate is the domain name for our site, strangely enough. Now, actually, I probably could get away, because this is a subdomain. The host is a subdomain. I've got another certificate that has a star.domain name. So, but that's fine. You can have multiple valid certificates for a given host. So I could use an existing certificate, but I'm showing you the process for creating one now. One thing that you might not know is that you can't create double wildcarded certificates. So you can't have star.star domain name. You can only have one level of wildcarding. But this one's going to be created specifically for this subdomain of abstractable.io. DNS validation. So to create this certificate, which validates the content sitting behind a certain host, we need to prove to AWS that we own that domain. Otherwise, we'll be spoofing, right? Yeah. There's a couple of ways we can do that. The easy one is, given that our domain name is hosted in AWS, is to use DNS validation. We'll see what that looks like in a sec. All right, so if we refresh this, we'll see that up here is our certificate. It's currently pending validation. What that pending validation piece is, if we go to Route 53, is the certificate manager just tried to create, and probably did, a CNAME record. Where is it? It's not that one. I see that. Anyway, what it's done is created a record in Route 53, which is a CNAME, and then certificate manager is checking to see if that record is in there.
That's all, isn't it?
It is. Usually we don't need to. Did this morning. I'm pretty sure I didn't need to hint add it to do that.
Usually validates pretty quick.
It does. There we go. So it's this one down here. So it's created the CNAME record. So we should see this status update to success pretty soon. See if we can peek ahead a little bit to the CloudFront configuration, and that should come good while we're waiting. All right, so we want to be able to do caching and throttling and all kinds of cool stuff, which we need CloudFront for. So we're going to come to CloudFront console, create a distribution. Our origin domain is the S3 buckets domain name. So not our logs bucket, but this guy here. And we're going to use the thing. So I mentioned before, so at the moment, the bucket that will host the content is pretty locked down, right? Nothing can really read anything other than me as the bucket owner. So what we're going to create is this thing called an origin access identity, which is it's just a security principle that we're going to let CloudFront create one and give it the rights to speak to that bucket. So yes, we're going to use an origin access identity. We're going to create a new origin access identity. We'll take its default name. And obviously we're going to create that identity with rights to look at the bucket, but we also need to tell the bucket through its policy that that origin access identity is allowed to access the bucket. CloudFront will nicely, given that we've got the permissions to do this, it will automatically update the target bucket policy for the OI, the origin access identity now if we ask it to, which we will. We're going to redirect HTTP to HTTPS because why would we support unencrypted traffic? Cache policy, for now, we're going to set the caching to disabled because if we make any changes while we're in development, we have to go through a whole cache invalidation process in CloudFront, and that takes minutes usually to process. So while we're still testing and wanting to make sure everything's okay, we can disable caching. In production, we would sort of come back and re-enable that at some point. Accept most of those defaults for now. Here is our certificate. Let's just quickly run back to ACM and see. There we go. So that certificate has been issued now. So we should see it come up in this list. And it's not nice. Refresh.
Is it in USC?
There it is. So look here. So we're in CloudFront. CloudFront is a global service, so we haven't had to change back. So we've gone with the recommended security policy. We're going to turn on standard logging, and it's going to ask us to select a bucket to put that in. Well, here's the bucket that we created before for our logs. We're just going to give those logs a prefix. Interestingly, now IPv6 is on by default, but for those that care, it's still not going to work unless in Route 53 you've created an AAAA record, which is like an A record. It resolves a domain name to an IP address, but AAAA resolves a domain name to an IPv6 address. So even though that's on, it's not actually going to work over IPv6 unless we have the right DNS configuration. We'll create our distribution. Given time, maybe we'll pass over the kind of DNS 101. Sounds like most people are roughly across that configuration. Right, so here's where we start to tie some things together. We're going to come back to Route 53. We're going to go to our abstractable.io hosted zone. And we need to create a record. So this is going to be our endpoint for our site. The record name is going to be our host name. And it is going to be an A record. So this is the record that's going to resolve our host name to its destination, which in vanilla DNS would be an IP address. But we're in the wonderful world of AWS and we've got some shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts to us is this alias. So rather than having to find the IP address of the S3 bucket, we can click alias and it's going to give us a list of things that we can choose from. So alias to CloudFront distribution. That's interesting. How's our CloudFront distribution going? So that's still deploying, which is why we can't see it. CloudFront, if you haven't used it much before, can be, so the reason these operations take a long time is because it's publishing information to every single point of presence around the world, and there are hundreds of those. So deployment won't complete until each of those points of presence acknowledges that it's received the changes. It can be a little bit indeterministic. So sometimes it happens in a couple of minutes, sometimes it takes longer.
I saw it happening in 2 minutes.
You never saw it happen in 2 minutes?
No. 40 minutes plus.
I've seen it take up to 40 minutes, but I did one.
Done.
There we go. Done.
Oh,
That was under 2 minutes.
So back to
something else like with cache validation or things.
Yeah, maybe let's sort of.
Well, they just want a very big thing to cache this website. So
CloudFront distribution. Oh, come on. Just going to start from, I might need to requery. Create record or our site as an alias to our CloudFront distribution. Come on.
Defaults to Virginia.
Present a case.
yeah, well, CloudFront's a global service. So.
But still defaults to Virginia.
This is what we're missing here.
Yeah, and attach
The alternate domain name didn't take. So let's go back into our distribution configuration. So right now, this distribution responds to this host name, but it's not responding to our friendly host name. So we need to update that.
Yeah.
Add item. Actually, it needs to be. Okay, so now we have our domain name there. Maybe this will come up now.
To refresh it. Page. Probably.
No. There we go. Now, that is all about back-end infrastructure done. A bucket for content, a bucket for logs, a certificate, and a CloudFront distribution. What we haven't done is actually deployed our site. Deployment, as I said, I've never seen anything so simple in my life.
Upload the whole thing.
Pretty much, this is my simple file. I don't even usually have as much variable checking as this. I just make sure a couple of the variables that we need here are done, test that we can actually access AWS using the profile that we're deploying with. We're going to CD to our site name, run Jekyll build, and do an S3 sync that's just going to copy the content up. So we give that a crack. Site, copying the content, we're done. So assuming that all the fairy dust has settled, we should now be able to go to public internet. I mean, you'll see that we were redirected to HTTPS. So it would be a big shame to finish this demo without actually seeing the
That's okay.
the actual result, but it is there. This is the one part that is not. I mean, one thing that we didn't check is this actual content in the bucket. So actually, it's probably worth heading.
It's a good thing to check.
Yes, so the content is actually there. We just don't have the.
If we check that access log bucket, is it going to show access denied?
Oh, yeah, indeed. This functionality also needs to be checked.
No, I mean, should it show now that access denied errors as well? I mean, I'm just curious what is going to that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
so I don't know what I was doing when I entered in the details, but I didn't enter in the default object as well.
Yeah.
So I've just added index HTML to the URL and we're here.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not mapping / to index HTML.
Yeah. By default, okay, so you need to specify it. Okay, can you do it by default or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is our default root object.
Yeah, so you gotta set
yeah.
that to index.
Index HTML, that's it. Yeah, and it will work. Okay, cool.
The default root object.
Index.html.
You know, save changes. That was pretty quick.
Yep.
But now,
Sweet. Should add that to your markdown. So
it was in there.
Oh.
I thought I'd done it. I must have skipped a step.
no, that's awesome.
So obviously not a hugely complex set of resources. It's it's not a wouldn't be a complex cloud formation to get that stuff set up. Once you've done this once or twice, it can be really quick just to throw up some new stuff.
Even set up a pipeline, so whenever you commit to a master branch, it will update the S3.
My say abstractable.io, the parent domain is set up like that. Yep. So but the deployment process is actually so quick. Sometimes you wonder whether it's even worth the bother of the, because like you see it, you preview it live and then you just up arrow return and it copies up to S3.